Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. This is Scott Parkin, your co-host in Berkeley, California, and Bob, my co-host, is off on assignment. But today I'm going to be talking with two guests about the recent landmark case in Florida where a federal jury has ordered Chiquita Brands International to pay over $38 million in damages to the families of 8 Colombian men who were killed by paramilitaries that were funded by the banana giant. Chiquita had previously pled guilty to paying the far-right United Defense Forces of Colombia, a paramilitary group, or also known as the AUC, $1.7 million. But as all legal things happen, it has taken many years for these legal process to play out. But joining me will be Dr. Rodrigo Acuña, who is a Latin American historian, a journalist. He is a editor of Alborada. He's the former host of Alborada's Indestructible podcast. And then I'll also be joined by Guillermo Andres Mosquera Miranda. And Guillermo is a Colombian school principal, teacher, small farmer, and a trade unionist. He and his family have actually fled Colombia due to death threats and assassination attempts. And they're actually living in Sydney, Australia, seeking political asylum. And so we'll be also talking about Guillermo's story as well, more fully inform from a personal viewpoint what happens when we see these American companies, international companies paying into these right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia. Enjoy the interview. Hey, this is Scott, and I'm back now with Guillermo and Rodrigo. And just for the listeners to know, Rodrigo is going to be translating for Guillermo today. Much appreciation for that. But welcome to the Green and Red podcast. Buenos dias. And maybe we could start with a question for Guillermo, which is, Guillermo, can you tell us a little bit about your background, what region you're from, where you worked in Colombia, that sort of thing, just like basic background.
Guillermo, si nos puedes decir un poco de tu pasado, un poco dónde trabajaste, de qué región eres de Colombia, un poco sobre ti.
Miranda.
My name is Guillermo Andres Mosquera Miranda. I'm a social leader, I'm a farmer.
De el departamento del Cauca, en el sur de Colombia.
From the Department of Cauca in the south of Colombia. My father belonged to the Patriotic Union. I'm from a campesino family. Together with my mother.
Mis tíos.
So some of my uncles also belong to the Patriotic Union, and it's a party that was born from the FARC and from the Communist Party. So this political party was wiped out by the Colombian state. The only ones that remained were the ones that survived, and approximately 10,000 people were murdered from this political party. I had the privilege to study in the public university in Colombia, which is very difficult to enroll in, to enter. I studied agricultural engineering. So he specialized in 3 areas of education. ¿Puedes repetir las especialidades?
La especialista en pedagogía.
Pedagogy.
Y en gerencia educativa o administración.
Administration. And basically the inquiry into educational knowledge.
Y pues políticamente yo.
So he was originally part of Defensa Agro, which is a farmers trade union, which is a national trade union throughout all of Colombia. So in his community, he was the founder of Ascanta, which is the union which represents the farmers in his region.
Líder y como.
So he carried out that role for approximately 20 years, and he also played a key role in the national strike which occurred a few years ago against the government of Duque. And he was also a spokesperson for the campesinos in the Havana peace process between the Colombian government and the FARC.
And he was the director or principal of a school as well. Correct.
That's the political work he did.
y,
He worked 5 years as a school teacher,
y luego fui rector por más de 10 años.
and then he was a school principal for more than 10 years.
Y pues desarrollé una propuesta pedagógica
So developed a educational,
que se llama La Granja de la Paz.
which is called the Farm of Peace.
Mhm.
So basically an agricultural school.
Tenía dos que era
It had two objectives.
que,
So the philosophy of the school was to create peace at a local level,
y la, recuperar el conocimiento ancestral campesino.
and the other objective was to recover the ancestral local knowledge, the local ancestral campesino farmers' knowledge.
The knowledge around farming practices and things of that nature.
Yes, of course.
El conocimiento
The knowledge includes recuperating or recovering the traditional seeds,
y
Mm.
the ancestral seeds, and how to produce them, which they have been lost
que se han perdido
because they've been lost due to the monocultural agricultural products such as coca.
And I had read that some of the programs within the school were to get youth out of that agriculture of the drug trade of coca.
Y tiene entendido que parte de los programas del colegio era para
claro.
que los muchachos en la zona no participen en el cultivo de coca.
Claro, evitábamos dos cosas.
We avoided two things.
Una era que nosotros teníamos una filosofía que era
So we had a philosophy to eradicate the production of coca
desde la
through developing consciousness in the students,
más
more than what the political right was always proposing, which was to persecute the youth, to persecute the campesinos that were growing coca.
reclutados.
And the other objective was for the youth not to be recruited by the criminal gangs and the paramilitary organizations that began to flourish in the area during the post-conflict period. And he was also part of all the trade union work around school teachers.
And so it's the school that's doing this, trying to break away from the mono economy, mono agriculture, but was also the union doing that as well.
So the work that he was doing at the school was a communal proposal. It wasn't part of the trade union. The campesino trade union was a part of that project.
I see. But not the teachers union.
Not the teachers union, yeah.
Right. And is it that work that led to the paramilitaries and the drug gangs targeting Guillermo?
Y ese trabajo fue el que llevó a los grupos criminales paramilitares poner en peligro tu vida.
Por supuesto,
Of course.
ese principal eso, pero
Principally
más
that.
por negociador.
But also because I was
del paramilitary.
because I played a role in the national strike, and because I was a defender of human rights.
Porque los grupos.
So one of his roles was to denounce the human rights violations in the region, and that denunciation was not simply against the government troops, but also criminal organizations, paramilitary organizations.
And what is the paramilitary that was doing this and that was I'm going to assume was prevalent in his region, in the region?
¿Quieres saber?
The name of the paramilitary.
Sí. Are you asking specifically the prominent paramilitary group in the region, or are you asking the paramilitary group that threatened?
I was asking about the one that threatened him.
I was threatened by a group which calls itself the dissidents of the FARC, the major central state.
Organización criminal.
But they actually a criminal organization which are at the service of drug dealing and at the interest or serving the interest of the Colombian political right. But they take the symbolism
y parte del discurso
and part of the rhetoric of the FARC,
y se hacen llamar una guerrilla.
and they call themselves a guerrilla group.
Y son los que
And they're the ones that are killing social leaders in Colombia. To this date, they've killed 82 social leaders. In this year alone, they've killed 82 social leaders.
Throughout Colombia or just in his region?
Throughout all of Colombia.
And the political right versus, I guess, the paramilitary right, are they give approval to this? Or remain quiet and just let them do the work?
La derecha política, they maintain themselves in silence because so now that the Attorney General in Colombia has commenced the process against the ex-president of Colombia, Alborada, these organizations have launched a reign of terror throughout the country.
In retaliation for the prosecution of Uribe.
Por la persecución de Uribe. Yes.
Para desviar.
So Uribe is the only president in the history of Colombia that's actually been put on trial. He's already been convicted. So I guess this is a process to destabilize Petro's government. Yes. So this group carries out criminal actions allied with some structures of the National Army so that the national media focuses on those actions, on those assassinations or attempted assassinations. So people don't look at the fact that Uribe is being thrown in prison.
And is the Petro administration cracking down on the far right paramilitaries? Is that also happening besides prosecuting Uribe?
So Petro went to El Cauca, which is where Guillermo is from, only a few days ago, with the objective of trying to recover militarily that part of Colombia. So Petro has launched a military offensive in that region, but also one of social investment.
This isn't the only paramilitary that's acting in the interests of Uribe either, right? There's other, like the AUC would be another one that's acting in the interest of Uribe.
No, esta organización paramilitar no es la única que está actuando en colaboración o en defensa de Uribe, también la AUC. Yes, of course.
Está el clan
the Clan of the Gulf is another organization.
Y precisamente ayer en la frontera entre Ecuador y Colombia lanzaron un nuevo grupo paramilitar.
So yesterday, between the border of Ecuador and Colombia, another new paramilitary organization was launched.
Que se llama Autodefensas Unidas de Nariño, AUN.
There's another one they called De Nariño, so the self-defense organization of Nariño, another part of Colombia.
And maybe this is also a question for you, Rodrigo. Also, what would be the impact of, we had this court case that was decided by a federal jury in the United States last week around Chiquita Banana International. And I'm wondering what's the impact of how American companies have been funding right-wing paramilitaries to go after trade unionists and other social leaders, if that is going to have any impact at all?
Okay, so my understanding is that decision in Florida has put pressure or has shamed the Colombian judiciary, and that's been said by Petro himself, that why has it taken a court in Florida to put on trial Chiquita and find them guilty of funding paramilitaries in Colombia. And I think that the answer is that historically the Colombian judiciary has been an extremely conservative right-wing establishment who has cared little or next to nothing about the average Colombians. As Guillermo said, Unión Patriótica was a political party established in the 1980s as part of a peace process during that era, and they were wiped out. They had three presidential candidates that were assassinated, and few people are ever key players. You might have cases of local commanders that are put on trial, local leaders, but the key players, there have been little efforts to go after them. And from my understanding is that's because they do the dirty work for the Colombian establishment. So this is classic counterinsurgency strategies and tactics in Latin America. They haven't been employed just in Colombia. If you can't get the army to go into certain parts of the country and terrorize the local campesinos and carry out major human rights violations. Then you pay local goons, you arm them, you train them. There have been people from Israel that have come into Colombia and provided training, and they're the ones that do the dirty work. I'll translate that question for Guillermo as well to see what his perspective is.
Okay.
It's not an isolated case. It's not the only case. So Colombia, since the 1920s, since the conflict commenced, the multinational corporations have supported counterinsurgency with two objectives, two or three objectives.
El primero,
the first,
digamos, por convicción de la guerra contra
el
socialismo.
So the first point would be out of political conviction, that they simply just oppose trade unions, leftist or progressive political parties. The second objective is to secure the regions or the geography of the resources that they're going to be exploiting. So they want to secure them, make sure they have control over those territories.
Entonces, por ejemplo,
so in 1928, there was a massacre in Colombia, and the United Fruit Company was involved. And so Gaitan was a former senator and presidential candidate, and he led the public denunciations against the United Fruit Company in Colombia.
Y esa misma zona es la que tiene Chiquita Brands para la producción.
And that same zone is the one that Chiquita controls until this day, because they've changed the name from United Fruit Company to Chiquita.
And that's the famous massacre that's mentioned in 100 Years of Solitude. Is that how you say that?
Yes.
And just for our audience, Chiquita, before it was Chiquita, was known as United Fruit, which is infamous in history, helping overthrow the Arbenz administration in Guatemala in 1954, etc.
Correct, yes.
Entonces, esa es una, pero después del proceso de paz que se estableció la Comisión de la Verdad y la JEP, la Justicia Especial para la Paz, se ha podido establecer de multinacionales de todo el mundo que han participado directamente en el conflicto, financiando los grupos paramilitares precisamente con esos intereses, que es explotar recursos, saquear, desplazar la gente que está en los territorios para ellos poder asegurar sus ganancias.
Since the conflict, or since the 2016 peace agreement between the government and the FARC, there has been a truth commission, and that truth commission has established, according to Guillermo, it has established a clear connection between numerous multinational corporations and paramilitaries in Colombia.
And that's where we're seeing names like Coca-Cola.
Exactamente.
Exactly.
Por ejemplo, la Anglo-Cola Chanti, que es sudafricana.
The Anglo-Cola Chanti, which is a company from South Africa, they've funded almost all paramilitarism in Colombia in order to secure the areas where the key minerals are found. In terms of the issue of the resource of coal, European company, Repsol, Chevron recently, and companies that are producing biofuel. There's a company called Ura Palma.
De Shell.
They're affiliated with Shell, and they also fund paramilitary groups in order to remove the campesinos from the areas. Uribe actually established a specific law for them called the law of Sidres. So once the peasants have been cleared, terrorized off the land, then the ownership of that land, it goes to the multinationals.
Entonces, lo que hacen en este momento es la Chiquita Brand, digamos, se dejó pillar, como decimos, se dejó.
So Chiquita Brand, Guillermo says they got busted. They let their guard down. So what multinationals do now is they create micro companies, and these are the ones that finance the groups. But the production is sold to the multinationals. Smurfy Kappa is also in this business. They're from Holland.
También en Latinoamérica.
¿Cuál es la compañía o son las compañías?
Se llama Smurfy Kappa, se llama Cartón de Colombia.
Okay.
Pero Smurfy Kappa lo que hace es sembrar eucaliptos australianos para que esa madera traerla a todo el mundo y producir papel.
So Smurfy Kappa is a company that a Dutch company which grows Australian eucalyptus, and then they cut that down and they sell the timber throughout the world. So the guilty verdict against Chiquita is a small symbol of justice for us. It becomes proof of all the denunciations that we, the human rights defenders, have been making throughout the world, denouncing that the conflict in Colombia is not an internal conflict.
Es un conflicto externo.
It's an external conflict, or a conflict with external factors.
Porque países
because countries
y corporaciones
and transnational corporations
lo han financiado.
have financed it. So, there's Chiquita, but you've also got the United States, which financed Plan Colombia and historically Plan Condor. And countries like Israel,
son los que
they've been the ones that have trained paramilitary groups in order to sow terror and to assure the interest of the multinational corporations. It's a geopolitical problem.
Many years, decades ago, I would say I was involved in a lot of campaign work around the School of the Americas, which was a training institute at Fort Benning, Georgia, where they trained a lot of Latin American police and military death squads, basically. And Colombia was always at the top of the list of the worst. And that was in the Uribe administration, and it was like 2002, 2003.
So Colombia is the country in Latin America which probably has the most, or the highest amount of US military bases inside its territory.
De inteligencia.
And these bases sell intelligence information to these paramilitary groups, and they train them. So we have not forgotten that there is an Israeli colonel called Yair Klein, who was in Colombia and helped train paramilitaries in the country.
Y también, por ejemplo, a Raúl Reyes, que era comandante de las FARC, pilotos israelíes acompañados con pilotos estadounidenses fueron los que lo masacraron en territorio ecuatoriano cuando él adelantaba un proceso de paz con la ONU.
And it was norteamericana y israelí.
O sea, los pilotos eran israelíes.
Israeli pilots, in coordination with the United States, we have not forgotten that they were the ones that killed the FARC commander Raúl Reyes, who was assassinated in Ecuadorian territory while he was carrying out peace negotiations.
Para que sea siempre el bastión de seguridad en favor de eso. O desde ahí desestabilizar los gobiernos progresistas.
So we have not forgotten that all of these actors are present in Colombia, and they're part of the conflict continuing, but also establishing a presence in Colombia in order to destabilize progressive governments in the region, such as Venezuela. For example, Rafael Correa in Ecuador,
desde Colombia,
they tried to destabilize his government from Colombia.
So the government in Ecuador is now a conservative government, correct? A right-wing government.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. My other question is, Colombia ranks as one of the worst, has some of the highest numbers of murders of trade unionists and human rights defenders and land defenders. And this is all connected to a large number of US bases in Colombia, the Israelis training with right-wing paramilitaries and military forces. And I'm just wondering if Guillermo could just comment on just the sort of extraordinary amount of that sort of just the wave of violence that is being perpetrated against the Colombian people and Colombian social movement.
Entonces, ¿quiere un comentario o tu opinión respecto el impacto sobre la población en términos de derechos humanos debido a que estos actores han financiado paramilitares en Colombia? Algo dice que se sabe que Colombia tiene el porcentaje más alto de sindicalistas asesinados casi anualmente. Entonces, ¿quieres saber un poco sobre esa área?
¿Sobre la condena de Chiquita?
No, en términos en Colombia, en Colombia. Since 2016, when the peace process commenced.
En Colombia se han
I
asesinado
couldn't give you an exact figure
alrededor de,
now, but roughly
de
1,700 leaders,
líderes sociales que son
social leaders,
sindicalistas, que
trade
son
union
defensores
leaders,
de derechos humanos.
human rights workers. In 2023, 192. That was the figure for 2003. That's, again, trade union leaders, human rights workers. So it's a tragedy because it's a genocide.
Pero,
so as time goes by, the mask falls off in terms of who's actually carrying out these crimes.
por ejemplo,
For example, the finding now, the ruling against Chiquita,
que es en Estados Unidos, más no en Colombia.
which took place again in the United States, not in Colombia.
En Colombia los jueces declararon inocente a Chiquita Brands.
In Colombia, the judges declared Chiquita innocent. They're at the service of the multinationals. But in the United States, they find them guilty. Knowing that the United States is one of the actors that finances the conflict in Colombia.
De la transformación que vive, a pesar de que nos están masacrando, digamos que dentro de ese genocidio dice, pues,
so this ruling against Chiquita contributes to the world knowing the atrocities that have been taking place in Colombia for a very long time, but it's also resulted in people being able to organize and mobilize and to have elected the country's first progressive government, the government of Petro. From our perspective, says Guillermo, it makes us think that perhaps all the huge sacrifices that we have made and the deaths that have occurred, things have been, something has been achieved, something is worthwhile.
And do you think there will be future prosecutions? Like, this was a civil suit. Do you think there'll be future prosecutions even in Colombia of some of these companies? Or
¿Piensa que futuro puede juicios en contra de estas transnacionales dentro de Colombia?
Digamos que el pueblo como colombiano.
So I think that the Colombian people will eventually demand that the Colombian judiciary carry out judicial processes against these transnational companies and over their interest in our country.
Y esperamos que,
so hopefully, based on what Petro has proposed, hopefully there will be a massive investigation into this conflict, but specifically the role that transnational corporations have played, and that will hopefully allow for a process of reconciliation. You have to understand, because you have to understand that the war in Colombia has always been about the country's resources. So it's a war that goes to the heart of capitalism, which is the exploitation of those resources.
My next question for Guillermo is around what were the events that led him to have to leave Colombia with his family after he did a lot of trade union activity and he did a lot of political work. And so what exactly happened that led him to have to leave Colombia?
Like any social leader in Colombia. So for more than a decade, I was threatened, I was persecuted. It's completely common for that type of persecution to take place against social leaders in Colombia. So the persecution, the stigma. But there were two attempts on my life.
El primero, pues llegaron a mi casa.
The first one, they came to my house.
Y rodearon la casa.
They surrounded my house.
Con la suerte que uno de los vecinos le dijo que yo no estaba dentro de la casa.
But luckily, one of my neighbors told them that I was not in the house.
Si no, ese día me habían desaparecido.
If not, that day they would have disappeared me. That took place in the municipality of Argelia, Cauca. And that's why I had to move to the capital of Cauca, which is Popayán. And as a result, I had to abandon my community and the communal process that I was involved in. And that political process involved trying to defend that territory and all of its rights. It has 19,000 hectares in relation to mining concessions. Behind those concessions are US multinational companies, German companies, South African companies. And in that territory, there's almost a complete war taking place, almost similar to what is taking place in Palestine. There's not a single day in that region where there aren't armed confrontations taking place. And they utilize the most modern weapons. For example, right now they're using drones. Even in Ukraine, they aren't necessarily always using drones, but they're using them in that part of Colombia. And this region forms part of a greater region called El Cañón de Mica. And there are 3 projects that are of transnational importance. So one is a freeway connecting the Pacific Ocean, and it aims to connect Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador. The second is the construction of one of the largest hydroelectric plants in South America. It's called Arriero, and in that area there's roughly 100,000 hectares that minerals such as gold are found, and uranium that can be exploited. But the campesinos, the farmers that live in those communities, we are a bother for all of that to take place. So what they've done there is to promote the cultivation of coca in order to promote the destruction of the jungle, and then finance the war with the resources of drug dealing. So via the Pacific is approximately 90% of the cocaine goes through the Pacific. So I come out of this area where this resistance has been taking place. And when I was in Popayan, working in a village called El Tambo, so a man came and put a gun to my head in front of my school. And luckily the gun did not fire. After that, they went to my house to look for me in Popayan. And then, of course, I knew that I had to leave in order not to die. I'll just add a little footnote there for your listeners. The footage of the assassination attempt that was actually filmed by the school cameras. So it was all caught on video. And yes, as Guillermo says, if the gun had fired, I think the gun jammed. The assassin would have murdered Guillermo, the school principal, the local campesino social leader. He would have been murdered outside of the school.
Did the cameras catch the person's face?
No, he was wearing a motorbike helmet. And he was wearing a face mask. We're having problem hearing you again, Scott.
Okay.
After that, I was hiding for 6 months in different cities throughout Colombia. And I was trying to figure out where to go to. So I thought about going to Canada, going to Mexico, Australia, and looking as to where I would be the most safe, where I would be safest. And finally, I had the luck of obtaining a visa to come to Australia. Canada denied me the visa. And we found out that Mexico was not really safe because one of my colleagues had been sequestered, had been kidnapped there.
Mm. And how long have you been in Australia now?
¿Cuánto tiempo llevas ahora en Australia?
El 7 de julio completo un año.
The 7th of
15 días.
July, I would have been here 1 year.
Y también mi esposa pues tiene una organización de mujeres.
And my wife also has an organization for women.
Muy importante.
Very important, based on the defense of female campesinas.
Mm-hmm.
She's also an educator, I should add. She's worked as a school psychologist. And my brother was a candidate. So he was also a political candidate around the peace process in Havana.
And so then my final question is, what is the status of your asylum case? Is it in progress? Is there any signs that it may be approved?
And so I currently asked for a visa as a refugee.
Visa.
And the government has me in this process called of a bridging visa. According to Australian laws, they're going to try and prove how real the case is. And at least for 2 years, I need to be involved in this bridging visa process. In the framework of Australian laws does leave me without many rights.
Sin derecho a recibir ayudas.
For example, I can't receive numerous rights. Medicare, he doesn't have access to health. He doesn't have the right to have his children enrolled in the public school system here, which is free. It's taxpayer funded.
Entonces, y después, pues, la idea es poder siempre.
So my hope and my dream is that one day I will be able to return to Colombia in circumstances where my security will be fulfilled, it will be secure. I won't have security issues, and I'll be able to reintegrate myself into the social process and the political work that I was previously involved in. I can add a footnote there for your listeners as well, that the evidence is, I think, so considerable that the Australian government should be questioned were it not to grant Guillermo a political asylum. There were investigations carried out by the Colombian judiciary to indicate that the assassination attempts against his life were real, that the threats were real. He also had government assigned bodyguards. He didn't mention that in his answer, but he actually had government bodyguards, bulletproof vests. His case was noted in the Colombian and the Latin American media. And he also, after these investigations by the judiciary, by the authorities in Colombia, he also managed to take his case to the Organization of American States. So he actually has a letter from the Organization of American States saying, requesting, if I remember correctly, requesting the Colombian government to provide security for him. But because these attempts were so serious and they came so close, essentially, if that gun had not jammed, Guillermo would not be alive. That it was no longer possible for the Colombian government to provide security for him. So here in Australia, several members of the community, including myself, have decided to support him and start a GoFundMe campaign. And we've reached out to different trade unions and different organizations in order for him to receive some economic support, because he's almost being left on his own. Him getting this bridging visa, certainly it's a step forward, but that does not allow him to have access to medical support, education, and his children are quite young. And as you can see, his case is quite serious, and he's someone that can speak to you at length about the history of Colombian politics, and someone who was very serious and very committed to his work in his community.
And has Australian labor and civil society stepped up and been supportive?
Some people have, but the process has been very slow. So that's why I have encouraged him to try and reach out, and we've been knocking on various doors. It's very hard because we all have, of course, lives, and we have bills to pay, and we have other activities. And although I've at times been labeled a political activist, I definitely don't see myself in that manner, because I think there are people that are far more active than I am. But also, it's a matter of time. It takes time to write to people. It takes time to organize meetings. So we do what we can, and we have managed to raise some funds, but that's, as I said, it's a long process, and it takes a lot of time. And part of the reason why I wanted to get him on your podcast was not just talk about Colombian politics as a political observer from the outside like myself, but to have someone who's actually lived it and suffered the process in the flesh.
I'm gonna wrap it up there. We're definitely gonna put the GoFundMe and any other links that you want to send me in the show notes. But I want to thank the two of you for joining me today.
Thank you kindly
por este espacio
for this space.
Yes.
De visualizar la problemática colombiana.
In order for people to visualize, for it to become visible, the issues and the problems in Colombia.
Esta existencia y vivir en paz en Colombia.
So this interview helps and supports all those communities that want to live in peace, want to live dignified lives in Colombia. Contributes a small grain of sand.
En la construcción económico, social, político.
Contributes a small grain of sand to a new focus, a different social and economic model.
Para somos explotados.
And yeah, for the world and for all of those peoples that are exploited, seriously exploited.
Bueno,
right. Thank you for denouncing the genocide
en Colombia
that's been taking place in Colombia.
Los defensores
genocide that's been taking place against trade union leaders, farmers, indigenous people, Afro-Colombians. Thank you very much.
Gracias por visualizar mi situación.
And thank you very much for bringing to light or promoting my personal situation.
Y la de mi familia.
And that of my family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
Hey friends, so that was Dr. Rodrigo Acuña, and Guillermo Mosquera talking about Chiquita Banana, right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia, and many other things. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. And then if you are listening to us on the many audio platforms, please give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to Green and Red Podcast, redpodcast.org, and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/Green Red Podcast. And until we talk again, please go out and make a lot of trouble and misbehave.